Thank you, Mike, and ladies and gentlemen, and to Heritage Foundation, thank you very much for sponsoring this forum and for inviting this distinguished group of panelists who will be here in a few minutes. I'm one of the diminishing number of former governors in the United States Senate, so I'm not one of those, Mike, who has a yearning desire to turn the Senate into the House. But that is a pretty apt description of what we're talking about today. I saw the title that Heritage had assigned this talk, and I changed it a little bit. I borrowed H.V. Kaltenborn's line, which you'll see in a few minutes when I end my remarks. I have a short video to show you of what some prominent Americans, including many Democrats, have said about the idea of changing the Senate filibuster rule. But this is what H.V. Kaltenborn, a radio announcer of the World War II era, had to say about the filibuster. He said it's democracy's finest show, the right to talk your head off. And so that's the subject of what I'd like to talk about for a few minutes this afternoon. Voters who turned out in November are going to be pretty disappointed when they learn the first thing that some Democrats want to do is to cut off the right of people they elected in November to make their voices heard on the floor of the United States Senate. Now, in the November election, voters showed that they very well remember the passage of the health care law on Christmas Eve 2009. Midnight sessions, voting in the midst of snowstorm, backroom deals, little time to read, amend, or debate the bill, passage by a straight party line vote. It was how it was done as much as what was done that angered the American people. Minority voices were silenced. Those who didn't like it were told, we won the election, we'll write the bill, we don't need your votes. The majority's attitude was just that. And one person even said, you can read it after we pass it. Of course, the result was a law that a majority of Americans now believe is an historic mistake, and the passage of the bill launched the beginning of an instant effort to repeal and replace the bill. Voters remembered all of this on November 6th, but only 6 weeks later, some Democratic senators seem to have completely forgotten it. I say that because on December 18, every returning Democratic senator sent Senator Reid, the majority leader, a letter asking him to, quote, take steps to bring Republican abuses of our rules to an end, unquote. So when the United States Senate convenes tomorrow for the 112th Congress, some have threatened to try to change the rules so it would be easier to do with every piece of legislation what they did with the health care bill. Ram it through with a partisan vote, with little debate, little amendment, little committee consideration, and without listening to minority voices. The brazenness of this proposed action is that Democrats are proposing to use the very tactics that in the past almost every Democratic leader has denounced, including President Obama and Vice President Biden when they were senators, who said such a thing would be a nuclear option, a naked power grab, and destructive of the Senate as a protector of minority rights. The Democratic proposal would allow the Senate to change its rules with only 51 votes, ending the historical practice of allowing any senator at any time to offer any amendment until 60 senators decided it's time to end the debate. As Investors Business Daily wrote, quote, the Senate Majority Leader has a plan to deal with the Republican electoral success. When you lose the game, the newspaper said, you simply change the rules. When you only have 53 votes, you lower the bar to 51. This is called election nullification, unquote. Now, there's no doubt that the Senate has been reduced to a shadow of itself as the world's greatest deliberative body, a place which, as Senator Arlen Specter said in his farewell address, has been distinctive because of, quote, the ability of any senator to offer virtually any amendment at any time, unquote. But the demise of the Senate is not because Republicans seek to filibuster. The real obstructionists have been the Democratic majority, which for an unprecedented number of times used their majority advantage to limit debate, not to allow amendments, and to bypass normal committee consideration of legislation. To be specific, according to the Congressional Research Service, number one, the majority leader has used his power to cut off all amendments and debate 44 times, more than the last 6 majority leaders combined. Number 2, the majority leader has moved to shut down debate the same day measures are considered, nearly 3 times more on average than the last 6 majority leaders. And number 3, the majority leader has set the record for bypassing the committee process, bringing a measure directly to the floor, bypassing committees, 43 times during the last 2 Congresses. Now let's be clear what we mean when we say the word filibuster. Let's say the majority leader brings up the health care bill, which is his right to do. I go down to the floor, the senator from Tennessee, to offer an amendment and to speak on the health care bill. The majority leader says, "No, Senator Alexander," and he cuts off my amendment. I object. The majority leader calls what I tried to do a filibuster. That's what he defines as a filibuster. I call what he did cutting off my right to speak and to amend, which is what I was elected to do. So the problem is not a record number of filibusters. The problem is a record number of attempts to cut off amendments and debate so that minority voices across America cannot be heard on the floor of the Senate. So the real party of no is the majority party that's been saying no to debate, no to voting on amendments that minority members believe improve legislation and express the voices of the people they represent. In fact, the reason the majority leader can claim there have been so many filibusters is because he actually is counting as filibusters the number of times he has moved to cut off debate. Instead of this power grab, as the new Congress arrives tomorrow, the goal should be to restore the Senate to its historic role, where the voices of the people can be heard rather than silenced, where their ideas can be offered as amendments rather than suppressed, and where those amendments can be debated and voted upon rather than cut off. To accomplish this, the Senate needs to change its behavior, not change its rules. The majority and minority leaders have been in discussion on steps that might help to accomplish this. I've been part of those discussions, some of them. I'd like to discuss this afternoon why it is essential, in my opinion, to our country that cooler heads prevail tomorrow when the Senate convenes. One good example the Democrats might follow is the one established by Republicans who gained control of both Senate and House of Representatives in 1995. That was the so-called Gingrich Revolution of '94. On the first day of the new Republican majority, Democratic Senator Harkin of Iowa proposed a rule change diluting the filibuster. Every single Republican senator voted against the change, even though supporting it clearly would have provided at least a temporary advantage for the Republican agenda. Here is why the Republicans who were in the majority then and Democrats who are in the majority today should reject a similar rules change. First, the proposal diminishes the rights of the minority. In his classic book, Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote that one of his 2 greatest fears for our young democracy was the, quote, tyranny of the majority, unquote, the possibility that a runaway majority might trample minority voices. Second, diluting the right to debate and vote on amendments deprives the nation of a valuable forum for achieving consensus on difficult issues. The founders knew what they were doing when they created 2 very different houses of Congress. Senators have 6-year terms. 1/3 of us are elected every 2 years. The Senate operates largely by unanimous consent. There is an opportunity unparalleled in any other legislative body in the world to debate and amend until a consensus finally is reached. This procedure takes longer, but it usually produces a better result, and a result that the country is more likely to accept. For example, after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was enacted by a bipartisan majority over a filibuster led by Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, Senator Russell then went home to Georgia and said that although he had fought the legislation with everything he had, quote, as long as it is there, it must be obeyed, unquote. Now compare that to the instant repeal movement that has been the result of jamming the health care law through in a partisan vote. Third, such a brazen power grab by Democrats this year will surely guarantee a similar action by Republicans in 2 years if we gain control of the Senate, as many observers think is likely. We have seen this happen with Senate consideration of judges. Democrats began the practice of filibustering President Bush's judges, even though those nominees were well qualified. And now Democrats are unhappy because many Republicans regard that as a precedent and have threatened to do the same to President Obama's nominees. Those who want to create a freight train running through the Senate today, as it does in the House, might think about whether they will want that freight train running through the Senate in 2 years, when the freight train might be the Tea Party Express. Finally, it's hard to see what partisan advantage Democrats hope to gain from destroying the Senate as a forum for consensus and protection of minority rights, since any legislation they jam through this year or next year without bipartisan support will undoubtedly die in the Republican-controlled House during the next 2 years. The reform the Senate needs is a change in behavior, not a change in rules. I've talked with many senators on both sides of the aisle, and I believe most of us want the same thing: a Senate where most bills are considered by committee, come to the floor as a result of bipartisan cooperation, are debated and amended and then voted upon. It was not so long ago that this was the standard operating procedure. I've seen the Senate off and on for more than 40 years. From the days in 1967 when I first came to Washington as Howard Baker's legislative assistant. In those days, there was only one legislative assistant in each Senate office. I came back for a while to help Senator Baker set up his leadership office in 1977, and I watched the way that Senator Baker and Senator Byrd led the Senate from 1977 to 1985, when the Democrats were in the majority for the first 4 years and the Republicans were in the majority the second 4 years. Then, most pieces of legislation that came to the floor started in committee. Then that legislation was open for amendment. There might be 300 amendments filed, and after a while, the majority leader would ask for a unanimous consent agreement to cut off the amendments. He always got it because he let everybody offer whatever amendments they wanted to offer. Then voting would begin and voting would continue. The leaders would, of course, work to persuade senators to limit their amendments so there wouldn't be 300 amendment votes. But that didn't always work. So the leaders kept the Senate in session, kept it in session during the evening, kept it in the session during Friday, sometimes even into the weekends. Senators got their amendments considered and the legislation was fully vetted, debated, and finally passed or voted down. Now, Senator Byrd knew the rules. I recall that when Republicans won the majority in 1981, Senator Baker went to see Senator Byrd and said this: "Bob, I know that you know the rules better than I do, so I'll make a deal with you. You don't surprise me, and I won't surprise you." Senator Byrd said, "Let me think about it." And the next day, Senator Byrd said yes, and the two of them managed the Senate effectively together for 8 years. Now, what would it take to restore today's Senate to the era of Senator Baker and Senator Byrd? Well, we have the answer from the master of the Senate rules himself, Senator Byrd, who in his last appearance before the Senate Rules Committee on May 19, 2010, said, quote, "Forceful confrontation to a threat of a filibuster is undoubtedly the antidote to that malady." Most recently, Senator Byrd went on, Senate Majority Leader Reid announced that the Senate would stay in session around the clock and take all the procedural steps necessary to bring financial reform legislation to the Senate. As preparations were made and cots rolled out, a deal was struck within hours, and the threat of filibuster was withdrawn. Senator Byrd said, "I also know that current Senate rules provide the means to break a filibuster," unquote. In those remarks, his last ones, as I said, Senator Byrd also went on to argue strenuously that our founding fathers intended the Senate to be a continuing body that allows for open and unlimited debate and the protection of minority rights. Senators, Senator Byrd said, have understood this since the Senate first convened. Then Senator Byrd went on, quote, in his notes of the Constitutional Convention on June 26, 1787, James Madison recorded that the ends to be served by the Senate were first, to protect the people against their rulers. Second, to protect the people against the transient impressions into which they might themselves be led. They themselves, as well as a numerous body of representatives, were liable to err, also from fickleness and passion. A necessary fence, this is Byrd quoting James Madison, against this danger would be to select a portion of enlightened citizens whose limited number and firmness might seasonably interpose against impetuous counsels. That's the end of that quote. That fence, Senator Byrd said, was the United States Senate. The right to filibuster anchors the necessary fence, but it is not a right intended to be abused. And then Senator Byrd concluded, there are many suggestions about what we should do. I know what we must not do. We must never, ever, ever, ever tear down the only wall, the necessary fence this nation has against the excess of the executive branch and the resultant haste and tyranny of the majority. That was Senator Robert Byrd in his last appearance before the Senate Rules Committee. What would it take to restore the years of Byrd and Baker when most bills come to the floor that are first considered in committee and when more amendments were considered, debated, and voted upon? Well, first, we'd have to recognize there has to be bipartisan cooperation and consensus on important issues. The days of we won the election, we jammed the bill through are going to have to be over. Senator Baker would not even bring a bill to the floor when Republicans were in the majority unless it had the support of the ranking Democratic committee member. Number two, recognize that senators are going to have to vote. Now, to say that may sound ridiculous to an outsider, but every Senate insider knows that a major reason why the majority cuts off amendments and debate is because Democratic members don't want to vote on controversial issues. That's like volunteering to be on the Grand Ole Opry, but then claiming that you don't want to sing. I mean, we should say if you don't want to vote, then don't run for the United States Senate. And the third thing that would restore the period that I'm talking about in the 1980s, according to Senator Byrd, would be to end the 3-day work week. The Senate convenes on most Mondays for a so-called bed check vote at 5:30. The Senate during 2010 did not vote on one single Friday. Let me repeat that. The United States Senate in the year 2010 did not vote on one single Friday. It is not possible for the minority to have the opportunity to offer, debate, and vote on amendments, or for the majority to forcefully confront a filibuster if every senator knows there will never be a vote on Friday. Now, there's some other steps that can be taken to help the Senate function better without impairing minority rights. One bipartisan suggestion has been to end the practice of secret holds. It seems reasonable to suggest or to expect a senator who intends to hold up a bill or a nomination to allow his colleagues and the world to know who he or she is, so that the merits of the hold can be evaluated and debated. Second, there is a crying need to make it easier for any president, Republican or Democrat, to staff his or her government with key officials within a reasonable period of time. One reason for the current delay is the president's own fault, taking an inordinately long time to vet his nominees. Second reason is shared responsibility, the maze of conflicting forms and FBI investigations and audits and ethics requirements and financial disclosures required both by the Senate and the White House. I spoke on the Senate floor on this, titling my speech, Innocent Until Nominated. The third obstacle, and one we should be able to do something about, is the excessive number of executive branch appointments requiring Senate confirmation. There have been bipartisan efforts to reduce these obstacles. With the support of the majority and minority leaders, perhaps we might achieve some success. Of course, even if all of these efforts succeed, there'll still be delayed nominations, bills that are killed before they come to the floor, and amendments that never see the light of day. This is nothing new. I can well remember when Senator Metzenbaum of Ohio put a secret hold on my nomination when President George H.W. Bush nominated to be the United States Secretary of Education. He held up my nomination for 3 months, never really saying why. I was very perplexed about this, so I went to see a friend, Senator Warren Rudman of New Hampshire. I asked him what I could do about Senator Metzenbaum's hold. He said nothing. And then he told me his story. President Ford had appointed Warren Rudman, when he was New Hampshire's Attorney General, to be a member of the Federal Communications Commission. This was in the 1970s. The Democratic senator from New Hampshire filibustered Rudman's appointment until Rudman finally asked the president to withdraw his name. Is that the end of the story? I asked Warren Rudman. No, he said. I ran against the so-and-so in the next election and beat him, and that's how I got in the Senate. So there are various ways to deal with filibusters and holes. Warren Rudman had one. During his time here, Senator Metzenbaum would sit at a desk at the front of the Senate and hold up almost every bill going through until the sponsoring senator obtained his approval. Before that, Senator Allen of Alabama did the same. And in the 1960s, Senator John Williams, they called him Whispering John because he didn't have a strong voice, he was on the floor regularly objecting to federal spending. That was when I first came here more than 40 years ago. Now, I have done my best to make the argument that the Senate and the country will be served best if cooler heads prevail and Democrats don't make their power grab tomorrow and try to make the Senate more like the House of Representatives. To permit them to do with any legislation what they did with the health care law. I've said that to do so will destroy minority rights, destroy the essential forum for consensus that the Senate now provides for difficult issues, and surely guarantee that Republicans will try to do the same thing to Democrats in 2 years. More than that, it's hard to see how Democrats can gain any partisan advantage from this destruction of the Senate and invitation for retribution, since any bill they force through the Senate in the next 2 years in a purely partisan way will surely be stopped by the Republican-controlled House of Representatives. But on this subject, I am not the most persuasive voice. I'm not the most persuasive voice against tomorrow's proposed action. Other voices are. And I've collected some of those voices, mostly Democratic leaders, who have wisely argued against changing the institution of the Senate in a way that would deprive minority voices in America of their right to be heard. Rather than tell you about those voices, I would like to conclude my remarks this afternoon by showing you a short video about what some of them have said.
Wild horses aren't going to drag me off this floor until those people have heard everything I've got to say, even if it takes all winter. Filibuster!
H.C. Kaltenborn speaking. Half of official Washington is here to see democracy's finest show, a filibuster. The right to talk your head off.
We must never, ever, ever, ever tear down the only wall, the necessary fence that this nation has against the excesses of the executive branch.
The checks and balances which have been at the core of this republic are about to be evaporated. The checks and balances which say that if you get 51% of the vote, you don't get your way 100% of the time.
You've got majority rule, and then you've got this Senate over here where people can slow things down, where they can debate, where they have something called the filibuster. You know, it seems like it's a little less than efficient. Well, that's right, it is. and deliberately designed to be so.
I totally oppose the idea of changing the filibuster rules. I think that's foolish in my view.
That's why we have a Senate, is to amend and to debate freely.
The whole idea of the Senate is not to have majority rule. It's to force consensus. It's to force there to be a group of senators on either side who have to respect one another's views so that they work together and produce 60 votes on important issues.
I can understand the temptation to change the rules that make the Senate so unique and simultaneously so terribly frustrating. But whether such temptation is motivated by a noble desire to speed up the legislative process or by pure political expediency, I believe such changes would be unwise.
The Senate is the only place in government where the rights of a numerical minority are so protected. A minority can be right, and minority views can certainly improve legislation. American people know that it's not just the voices of the senator from Kansas or the senator from Iowa that are suppressed when the majority leader cuts off the right to debate and the right to amend. It's the voices that we hear across this country who want to be heard on the Senate floor.
You just can't have good governance if you don't have discussion and different ideas brought forward.
Therefore, to my fellow senators who have never served a day in the minority, I urge you to pause in your enthusiasm to change Senate rules.
The filibuster is far from a procedural gimmick. It's part of the fabric of this institution we call the Senate. For 200 years, we've had the right to extend a debate. It's not some procedural gimmick. Some in this chamber want to throw out 214 years of Senate history in the quest for absolute power. They want to do away with Mr. Smith, as depicted in that great movie, being able to come to Washington. They want to do away with the filibuster. They think they're wiser than our founding fathers. I doubt that that's true.
That if the majority chooses to end the filibuster, if they choose to change the rules and put an end to democratic debate, then the fighting and the bitterness and the gridlock will only get worse.
Thank you, Senator. The senator is going to have to leave quickly, so I will just take the prerogative of the chair and ask one quick question. Senator, you alluded to it, I think, in your remarks, but if this rule were to be adopted and the Senate were to change in the way we've discussed, it seems like the only place where there would be unfettered open debate might be within committees. And I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts you have about, would the committee process in the Senate change dramatically as well, because that might be where all of the need to actually debate and amend and offer amendments would then default to.
Well, that's a very good insight, but the problem with that is that over the last two Congresses, as I mentioned in my remarks, Senator Reid has set a record for bringing bills to the floor directly and not going through committee. I mean, take the health care bill over a year ago. Sure, there were a lot of committee hearings about it, but when it got down to writing the bill, what did they do? They went off in a room by themselves, they being the Democrats, and this was in December, the snow was coming down, and then they brought it out, more than 2,000 pages. We were told you could find out what's in it after we pass it. So the problem with relying on committees for this is that one of the problems of the last few years has not just been cutting off debate or amendments on the floor, it's been bringing bills directly to the floor without going through a committee. You take the 9/11 bill that came up in the lame duck session. Everybody wanted to help the 9/11 heroes, but just to show up at the last minute with $7 billion proposal that hasn't been carefully considered to see where does the money go? Is it already going to people who got some before? Is it going to the people who really need help? That's what the committees are for. So when I say we need to get back to the era in the 1980s that Senator Byrd and Senator Baker presided over, I don't just mean allowing any senator to make any amendment. I mean, let the committees work a bill over. And I mentioned just in passing that Senator Baker, when he was the majority leader, had a habit, I'm not sure he did this in every case, he would tell his Republican committee chairman, don't bring a bill to the floor unless you've got the ranking Democratic members' support. And so you bring a bill to the floor, and then you can expect that you're likely to achieve some sort of consensus, and what do? You get a better result, and you get better acceptance. If I may say one last thing about that, I think it's very important to emphasize the fact that there are several reasons for consensus, for cooperation. One is you get a better result. You don't just jam it through in the middle of the night. But the second is people accept it. People are more likely to accept it. I mean, in the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson had big majorities in the Democratic Congress. But where did he have the Civil Rights Bill written? In the Republican leader's office, in Everett Dirksen's office. And why did he do that? Well, one reason was to be able to surmount a filibuster. But the other reason was President Johnson knew that was a volatile piece of legislation. He did civil rights legislation piece by piece from the 1950s on until finally, after he died, the Voting Rights Act. And he knew that if he had a bill that he and the Republican leader passed, written in the Republican leader's office, that people across the country, many of whom didn't like the bill, would look at it and say, well, you know, if Senator Dirksen is also for it, maybe it's okay, and maybe I'll accept it. And you have that wonderful image of Senator Russell, who led the opposition to the bill, instead of launching a movement to repeal it, went home to Georgia and said, I've done all I can to fight the bill, but it's the law of the land, and now we need to obey it.
Thank you, Senator.